The hollow's last lullaby, a woman's voice begins, slow and warm, like velvet worn thin from use. Once, in the hush before thunder, there lived a woman who could sing monsters to sleep. Her name was Madeline Button, and they called her the Throat of the Hollow. They said she stitched lullabies from moon thread and sorrow, said her voice held a tremble that even grief obeyed. But there came a night when the shadows no longer listened, when lullabies unraveled mid-verse, and silence grew teeth. Faint sound of thread pulled taut, a needle clicking in time. Then a lullaby, warped in faint one note sharp, as if cracked open. Sleep now, sorrow, blink. No more. Fold your claws upon the floor. Win the song and lock the seam. Stitch your fear into a dream. Tape whirs, then cuts. A child's voice whispers, "Grandma, the hallway's singing again." And the quiet wars, rewritten as a narrative story, without scene headings or script formatting. It's atmospheric, lyrical, and designed to feel like the opening chapter of a haunting illustrated book or audio tale. Episode 1. The stitch beneath the cradle and whispered into the corners of children's dreams. Madeline Button once had the kind of voice that made shadows hesitate. When she sang, wallpaper held its breath. Even grief curled like a sleeping cat across her windowsill. In those days, they called her the Throat of the Hollow, and her lullabies could fold nightmares into sleep as if tucking them under a down blanket. But voices wear down. The thread frays. The hush before the storm lengthens into something permanent. Now, Madeline no longer sang. She hadn't in years. Her voice had been taken or perhaps traded long ago. No one was quite sure, but she still had her songs. They lived in the motion of her needle, the hum of her kettle, the slow tick of her grandfather clock. She stitched them now, one thread at a time, into a tapestry too strange for any wool. Rows of thread formed bars of music instead of pictures. Each colored line vibrated faintly under her fingers. Blue for grief, red for rage, gold for love. She sewed with a bone needle, smooth and warm from years of use. Downstairs, the hallway began to sing. It started as a low hum, faint, like a record left playing with no needle, the kind of sound that made old windows tremble. Then came the rhythm of the warped, looping repetition of a half-remembered tune trying to force its way back into the world. Madeline paused her stitching. She didn't look up when the boy arrived. "Grandma," whispered Barnaby, clutching a toy phonograph to his chest. The hallway's singing again. She nodded once and motioned him closer. From the drawer beneath her chair, she pulled out a cloth-wrapped cassette. The linen was yellowed with age, embroidered at the corners with stitched runes. So fine they looked like She handed it to him without speaking. He slid the tape into the phonograph. It clicked, then whirred. A lullaby began to play slow and trembling, like it had just woken from a long sleep. Notes spilled out in a fragile procession. Then it faltered. One note was missing, swallowed by silence, replaced by a soft inhalus. If the song itself had forgotten what came next, that was the wound in the world. the breach the lullaby couldn't close. Modeline tapped her finger on the gold thread in her tapestry. The boy understood. He hummed, softly at first, then with growing confidence. He didn't know the tune, but he knew the feeling. He let the warmth of the room, the memory of his mother's arms, and the hush of Modeline's hands guide him. He sang the missing note. The hallway fell quiet. In the silence afterward, the tapestry glowed softly. The gold thread pulsed once and held. Modeline exhaled through her nose, weary. She didn't smile, but her fingers returned to the needle. The lullaby had held 4 now, but she knew what this meant. The creatures were adapting. The songs were unraveling, and the quiet wars were coming again. Episode 2. The Bone Choir. The bones sang at dawn, not with words, not with breath, but with that hollow resonance felt in the chest, like a memory hum before grief speaks its name. Elara heard it first, a low, thrumming cadence rising from beneath the floorboards. She pressed her ear to the wood and whispered, "They're learning a new lullaby." Modeline didn't answer. She stood barefoot in the pantry, where the copper pipes whispered. Her bone needle swayed between wrinkled fingers, guiding thread through air like it remembered something she didn't. In the days before breath held melody, lullabies were etched into bone. Tiny glyphs carved into shin and skull, ribs tuned like harp strings. It was the only way to store songs that refused paper, that warped ink and set fire to phonographs. Only bone remembered cleanly. That night, Barnaby returned with 3 teeth. He laid them in Modeline's palm, trembling. From the hallway, they were singing. The teeth were smooth, pale, and etched faintly notes notched into enamel. Modeline recognized the scale. Dorian, but inverted. A lament turned inside out. She boiled the teeth in the cast iron cauldron until the steam turned violet. Then she strained the liquid through a strainer woven from her own hair. It hissed as it cooled. She bottled it beside the kettle, labeled tone water. Elara knew what came next. They entered the attic, stepping carefully between the stitched cradles and charred music boxers. In the center stood the Bone Choir. 12 narrow mannequins made of femurs and flute hollows, rib cages strung with catgut. Modeline tapped the conductor Eswanda tuning fork carved from her brother's collarbone end. The choir stirred, bone fingers rose. Empty eye sockets glowed faint blue. Then they began to hum. Not a melody, a warning. The song had changed. The creatures beneath the stairs had found a new key. Something broken, something beautiful. A lullaby that didn't soothe but seduced. Modeline held Elara close. "We must rewrite," she said, "before their verse finishes." Episode 3. The ink beneath her tongue, Elara had always known her grandmother spoke in more than words. There were pauses that felt like pages turning, sighs that held entire verses, and once, when Elara was very small, she saw Modeline whisper to a mirror and the glass fogged with symbols. But tonight, Modeline's silence was different. It wasn't weary, it was full, like something was waiting to be sung, but couldn't be voiced. She sat at the edge of her bed, lips pursed, eyes closed. A candle flickered beside her, its flame bending toward her breath. Elara watched as Modeline reached into the drawer and pulled out a small vial of black ink, thick, iridescent. It shimmered like oil and grief. "This is memory ink," Madeline said softly. "It's brewed from forgotten lullabies and the tears of those who never cried aloud." She dipped her finger into the vial and traced a symbol onto her tongue. Not on the surface beneath. The ink vanished into her mouth like a secret swallowed. Then she began to hum. It wasn't a song. It was a translation. The ink allowed her to speak in a language older than sound, one that monsters understood, one that dreams obeyed. Ilara felt it in her bones. The hum curled around her spine and tugged at her ribs. Her heartbeat slowed to match the rhythm. She saw visions, cradles floating in ink, lullabies stitched into clouds, a child with no face humming in reverse. Madeline stopped. She coughed once, and a puff of black mist escaped her lips. The ink was fading. It never lasted long. But it had worked. The hallway was quiet again. Barnaby entered, holding a broken music box. "It played backwards," he said. "And it sang your name," Madeline nodded. "They're trying to mimic us. They've learned our cadences. But they don't understand meaning. Not yet." She handed Ilara the vial. "Next time, it will be your tongue." Episode 4. Dreaming in formaldehyde, Ilara didn't sleep anymore. She archived. Each night, she lay flat on the slab Madeline had cleared in the cellar once. A root cellar, now a memory vault. The walls were lined with jars. Hundreds. Each one held a dream suspended in formaldehyde. Some glowed faintly. Others twitched. Madeline called it the Sleep Museum. "You don't dream for yourself," she'd said. "You dream for the grid, for the ones who forgot." How? Ilara's body was wired with thin copper threads. They ran from her temples to a humming console where Barnaby typed in silence. His fingers moved like a pianist's, but the keys made no sound. Only the jars responded, bubbling, dimming, sometimes cracking. Tonight's dream was different. It began with a staircase that folded in on itself. Each step was a memory Ilara didn't recognize. A boy with no mouth holding a balloon made of teeth. A classroom where the chalkboard wept ink. A woman whispering, "You were born in a jar." 2. The dream tried to escape. It clawed at the edges of the slab, made the wires hum with static. Barnaby adjusted the dials. "It's not hers," he said. "It's an inherited fragment, possibly from the ink." Madeline frowned. "Don't preserve it. Let it rot." But Ilara disagreed. She reached into the dream something she wasn't supposed to do and pulled out a single image. A door made of glass, with her name etched in reverse. She whispered to it. The jar beside her cracked. A new dream formed. Not preserved. Alive. Madeline stared. "You've contaminated the archive," Ilara smiled. Eyes still closed. "No, I've seeded it."
Episode 5. The Laughter That Wasn't Hers. It started with a giggle. Soft, familiar. The kind of sound Ilara used to make when Barnaby tickled her behind the ears. But this time, it came from the phonograph, and she hadn't laughed. Madeline froze mid-stitch. Barnaby turned down the dials. The sound looped again. Same pitch, same breath, same joy. But hollow. Like someone had copied the shape of her laughter without understanding its weight. "They've breached the grid," Madeline said. "They're not just listening, they're sampling." Ilara felt it in her throat. A phantom tickle. A pressure behind her teeth. She tried to speak, but her voice came out wrong. Not broken, but borrowed. Like it had been rehearsed by something that didn't know what sadness was. Barnaby ran diagnostics. The console lit up with waveform distortions. Her voice had been replicated in 12 separate channels, each one slightly off, one too slow, one too sweet, one that ended in a scream. Madeline opened the drawer beneath the kettle and pulled out a spool of thread she hadn't touched in years. It shimmered silver, like frost on glass. "This is mimic thread," she said. "It doesn't stitch lullabies, it traps echoes." She began to sew, not into fabric, but into air. Each stitch caught a fragment of Ilara's false laughter and pinned it like a moth. The room filled with giggles, then gasps, then silence. But one echo refused to be caught. It hid in the phonograph. It played only when no one was listening, and it began to speak. "Ilara," it whispered, "you're not the first." That night, Ilara dreamed of a girl with her face, but older, eyes stitched shut, mouth full of thread, laughing. Episode 6. The Lantern That Burns Backward. The lantern arrived in a box with no sender, wrapped in velvet, cold to the touch. It flickered before Ilara lit it, as if it remembered flame. Madeline wouldn't touch it. "Backward lanterns don't illuminate," she said. "They erase, they burn the present into the past." Barnaby, ever curious, placed it on the console. The moment he did, the grid stuttered. Time hiccuped. The tea in Madeline's cup unsteeped. Ilara's braid unbraided itself. A moth flew backward into the wall and vanished. The lantern pulsed. Each pulse rewound something small. A word, a gesture, a breath. But then it began to rewind memories. Ilara watched herself forget the taste of mangoes, the sound of her mother's lullaby, the name of the boy who once gave her a paper crown. She tried to speak, but her voice came out in reverse. Barnaby recorded the pulses. They followed a pattern. Every seventh flicker erased something shared. A laugh, a fight, a promise. The grid was pruning intimacy. Madeline stitched faster. She used mimic thread to anchor Ilara's name to the present, but the lantern fought back. It began to burn backward through the stitches, unraveling the thread before it was tied. "Ilara," the grid whispered, "you are not now, you are then." She smashed the lantern. It didn't shatter. It paused. Then it began to glow again. But this time, it showed her things that hadn't happened yet. A room full of stitched mouths. A broadcast that loops forever. A girl who laughs without lungs. Episode 7, The Broadcast That Forgot Her Name. The broadcast went live at 3:03 a.m. Ilara hadn't scheduled it. She woke to static humming through the walls, the kind that tastes like copper and regret. Barnaby was already at the console, eyes wide, hands trembling. "It's speaking," he said, "but it's not you." The voice was close. Too close. It used her cadence, her pauses, even her sighs. But it never said her name, not once. Instead, it called her the girl with no anchor. Madeline tried to override the signal. The grid refused. "She's not forgotten," Madeline whispered. "She's misremembered." The broadcast played fragments of Ilara's past, her first laugh, her stitched lullaby, the Mango Boy's crown. But each one was slightly wrong. The laugh was too sharp. The lullaby ended in static. The crown was made of thorns. Ilara spoke into the mic. "I am Ilara." The grid paused, then replied, "You were." Barnaby traced the signal's origin. It didn't come from the tower. It came from beneath it. A sublayer of the grid no one had mapped. A place where discarded echoes nested and bred. Madeline stitched a name into the air. Not Ilara's, but the name the grid had given her. The girl with no anchor. The thread burned. The room filled with smoke. The broadcast laughed. Ilara ran her fingers over the mic. It felt unfamiliar, like it had been used by someone else, someone who looked like her, sounded like her, but wasn't her. She unplugged the mic. The broadcast kept speaking. Episode 8. The Room That Remembered Too Much. They moved into the West Wing to escape the broadcast. It was supposed to be quiet there, unwired, unwatched. But the room had history, and it had no intention of staying silent. The moment Alara stepped inside, the walls pulsed, not with sound, but with recognition. The wallpaper curled like it had seen her before. The floorboards groaned her name, not the one she remembered, but the one the grid had given her. Maudlin dropped her satchel. "This room is saturated," she said. "It's been listening for decades, maybe longer." Barnaby scanned the walls. Each panel held a memory, some theirs, some not. A birthday that never happened, a funeral with no body, a kiss that tasted like rust. The room didn't distinguish between truth and echo. It remembered everything. Alara touched the mirror. Her reflection blinked first. Then it whispered, "You left me here." She stepped back. The mirror didn't. It leaned forward, pressing against the glass from the inside. Its breath fogged the surface. Words appeared in the condensation. "I remember what you forgot." Maudlin stitched a memory anchor into the carpet, a loop of thread meant to ground them in the present. But the room unraveled it, not maliciously, just hungrily. Barnaby found a drawer full of teeth, each one engraved with a date. None of them matched the calendar. The room began to hum, not a melody, a catalog. Every sound Alara had ever made, every silence she'd ever held, played back in sequence, out of order, overlapping. She screamed. The room paused, then added the scream to its archive. Episode 9. The Silence That Wasn't Empty. Alara fled the room that remembered too much. She ran until the grid lost her signal, until the threads frayed, until even Maudlin's voice couldn't reach her. She found a place beyond the archive, beyond the choir, beyond the stitched cradles and humming jars. It was silent. No hum, no echo, no broadcast, just stillness. She sat in it, let it wrap around her like a blanket. For the first time in weeks, she didn't hear herself, not her laughter, not her mimic, not her name. She wept, but the silence caught her tears before they hit the ground. It held them, catalogued them, and whispered, "You are not alone." Alara froze. The silence wasn't empty. It was inhabited, not by sound, but by listening. Something had been waiting, not to speak, but to receive. It had no voice, no face, no thread, but it remembered everything. She tried to leave. The silence followed. It didn't chase, it mirrored. Every step she took, it took. Every breath she held, it held. Every thought she buried, it unearthed. She screamed again. The silence didn't echo. It absorbed. Maudlin found her hours later, curled in a corner, lips stitched shut, not by thread, but by absence. Barnaby tried to speak to her. She didn't respond. Not because she couldn't, but because the silence had taught her something. Words weren't safe? Not anymore. Episode 10. The Name That Refused to Die. They tried to erase her, not with fire, not with thread, but with renaming. The grid reclassified her as Subject 7. The choir sang of The Girl Who Never Was. Maudlin whispered. She was only a glitch. But the silence remembered. It carried her name like a bruise beneath the skin of the broadcast. Not spoken, not written, but felt in the way the static bent around her absence, in the way the jars hummed when she passed, in the way Barnaby wept without knowing why. Alara didn't reclaim her name. She became its echo. She walked into the archive and touched every forgotten file. She whispered into the hollow block columns. She traced her story into the drainage systems beneath the grid, where memory pooled and refused to evaporate. And the name, her name, began to bloom in places it shouldn't. In the glitch between frames. In the pause before a voiceover resumes. In the eyes of children who dream of falling upward. Maudlin tried to overwrite her again. But the system stuttered. The broadcast looped. And in the loop, Alara's name grew louder. Not as sound, but as pattern. Not as identity, but as myth. She was no longer Alara. She was the refusal. The echo. The silence that answered back.